While the Army is training new soldiers, the nation works around the clock, pouring its energy and resources into the war effort. Wars cost a tremendous amount of money. To pay for the war, Congress passes new taxes on corporate profits and imposes stiff personal income taxes for the first time. Rallied by Hollywood stars, Americans of all classes buy Liberty bonds to help win the war. The federal government mobilizes the entire American economy, taking unprecedented control through a series of boards and agencies.
The government sets up a war industries board and brings in executives from top corporations to supervise the conversion of American factories and shops from a peacetime to a wartime economy. And there's a very close cooperation between business and government that will continue after the war ends.
The new Fuel Administration allocates the coal resources necessary for operation of the nation's railroads and factories. The Railroad War Board takes over and coordinates the nation's sprawling transportation system. Perhaps the most successful government agency is the Food Administration, which under the slogan, "Food will win the war," dramatically increases domestic production of wheat and other grains from 45 million acres in 1917 to 75 million in 1919. Campaigns to serve just enough and use all leftovers, wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, and porkless Thursdays and Saturdays result in substantial conservation of food resources. It not only puts cheap food on American tables, but also war-torn Europe. The nation's workers also benefit as the new National War Labor Board arbitrates labor disputes, establishes an 8-hour day for war workers, and also endorses equal pay for women workers. Production soars as American factories pour out clothing, munitions, and ships in record time. Factories working round the clock require unprecedented numbers of workers.
The Great War had a tremendous impact on migration of people in the country, partly because of the fact that the war had cut off immigration from Europe, and there was great need for workers.
So American businessmen face a dilemma. Where are they going to get the workers for their factories? And the place they find them is among African Americans in the South, who up until the First World War had been excluded from industrial employment except as strike breakers. So with these new opportunities, you have the beginnings of what becomes known as the Great Migration.
More than 400,000 African American men and women head north to the industrial cities. The Great Migration, unleashed by the First World War, continues throughout the 1920s as more than 1.5 million men and women seek new lives in urban areas of the United States. During the Great War, about 1 million women also joined the labor force for the first time, and many of the nation's 8 million working women switch from low-paying domestic service to higher-paying industrial jobs. Women's contributions to the war effort pushed their campaign for suffrage to its successful conclusion with ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. The World War brings to women the right to vote. To win the war, the nation needs to mobilize people's minds as well as their bodies. The Wilson administration sets up the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, to rally Americans' support of the Allied cause. The CPI passes out 75 million pieces of patriotic literature and trains hundreds of volunteers called 4-Minute Men to give speeches in movie theaters. The CPI's mine mobilization campaigns help to whip the public into a frenzy of patriotism and contribute to a climate of suspicion and anti-German hysteria.
Suddenly, when the war broke out and the United States found itself fighting Germany, the Germans were turned from being representatives of culture and civilization to being barbaric Huns. So an anti-German feeling took over the country to the point where people started changing street names from Kaiser Avenue to Wilson Street. German measles was outlawed and became Liberty measles. Sauerkraut was outlawed and became Liberty cabbage. German music was banned from symphony halls. The German language was forbidden to be taught in American high schools. Some Germans were even lynched.
Vigilante groups like the American Protective League mobilized close to 250,000 self-appointed agents to spy on their neighbors and fellow workers. Law enforcement officials tolerate little criticism of American values and institutions during wartime. Perceiving opposition to government policies as treason, the Wilson administration passes the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which lets the government crack down on dissenters. The government prosecutes more than 2,000 people under these laws, including socialist labor leader Eugene Debs, who receives a 10-year prison term for a speech accusing the United States of imperialism for entering the war. Few Americans protest government violation of the Bill of Rights. The country's attention is focused overseas on the exploits of the U.S. Expeditionary Force. To head the American Expeditionary Force, President Wilson selects General John J. Blackjack Pershing, a tough career soldier who had led the army that pursued Pancho Villa into Mexico in 1916. In June 1917, the first 15,000 American doughboys arrive in France, just in time to join the French and English in defense against a massive German offensive. On the Eastern Front, Germany pounds Russia into submission. In March 1917, the Russian monarchy collapses. Promising peace, land, and bread, Bolshevik revolutionaries, led by Vladimir Lenin, take control of the world's largest nation and establish the world's first communist government. The new Russian government then pulls out of the war and signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany on March 3, 1918. Concentrating all its forces on the Western Front, the Germans in March 1918 launch a major offense and by May advance within 50 miles of Paris. American soldiers see their first action helping the French repel the Germans in the battles of Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. In mid-July, U.S. soldiers help spearhead a counteroffensive that drives back the Germans to their final defensive stand at the Meuse-Argonne forest. Fresh U.S. troops and supplies turn the tide. Demoralized and out of supplies, Germany calls for peace. By the time it's over, the Great War claims the lives of 8 million soldiers and close to 7 million civilians. During the 18 months of the United States involvement, close to 51,000 American servicemen are killed in action. Another 60,000 die from other causes, mainly an influenza pandemic that sweeps the world in 1918, killing 500,000 American civilians and close to 20 million people worldwide. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, in a railroad car nestled in the forest of Compiègne, France, the final armistice is negotiated. The war is over. President Wilson arrives in France with his own idealistic 14-point plan that he hopes will serve as a blueprint for the post-war world. The plan includes a call for the end of secret diplomacy, freedom of the seas, elimination of trade barriers, arms reduction, and the right of nations controlled by European powers to political self-determination.